Hey everyone, it's your TA Brandon here. So the video you're about to watch is a video put together by myself and my fellow TAs Eric, Joe, and then also your instructor Derek. We worked really hard on this video. We wanted you to be able to experience one of our walks in the forest that we normally would do for this class, but due to COVID and the quarantine situation that we currently find ourselves in, that's just not practical and it's not safe. So we have went out to the woods for you. We videotaped some of the plants that you're going to see on recognition plant list 1. And we put together this video to educate you about these plants. And if you like the video, we'd love to hear your feedback about it. If there's stuff you don't like about the video, then please let us know about it as well. The video is not too long. It's much shorter than an actual walk would be. But we do hope that you enjoy the video, and yeah, so here it is.
So what we're looking at right now is the American beech, Fagus grandifolia. It's in the beech family, which is Fagaceae, and it is one of the most easily recognizable trees, in part because of its bark. In suburban areas, it usually has a lot of graffiti like this, which is too bad, but American beech has this very smooth, light gray bark that is characteristic of it in our area. The leaves are also pretty easy to ID. They are, get this out. They are simple leaves. They are arranged alternately across the stem. They are generally elliptic in shape with this very neatly pinnate venation. You can see that those secondary veins go straight out all the way to the margin. It's one of the few plants that we have that looks like that. The buds, both the terminal buds and the lateral buds, are sort of long and pointy. At this time of year, they haven't started developing yet, but in spring before they leaf out, they can be an inch long. They get quite long and pointy. Beeches tend to live in somewhat moist, fire-sheltered areas, but they're still pretty common in much of North Carolina. So that's it for beech. Shrubs are also woody, but they tend to be smaller and are often multiple trunks. This particular one, however, just has a single trunk, and it's often a larger shrub. This is Viburnum prunifolium, or black haw. It's in the muscatel family, which is Acer. So it's pretty common in the eastern United States. And it's the first that has oppositely arranged leaves. You can see that there are 2 leaves at every node. You can see this is a node, and there are 2 leaves that come off at each node. The specific name for this one, prunifolium, means cherry-leafed, and the leaves are kind of similar to cherry leaves, in that they're roughly elliptical, and they have very fine dentation around the margins. And so that's how you're going to want to identify this particular shrub. It's got opposite leaves, and then the leaves themselves are sort of broadly elliptic, and then it's got this sort of finely dentate margins. All right, our next tree is a small understory tree. This is the eastern redbud, Cercis canadensis. It's in the pea and bean family, Fabaceae, not to be confused with Fagaceae. The leaves in this family are usually compound leaves. And that means that the whole leaf itself is divided into smaller, distinct leaflets. This tree is also a compound leaf, but it only has 1 leaflet, so this is unifoliolate. What you'll see is at the very base of the leaf blade and the top of the petiole, there is this little bump. This is called a pulvinus, and this is what's indicating where the rachis used to be. So you can see it right there. And that's characteristic of a unifoliolate leaf. It's sort of a joint that can move the leaves around. The leaves themselves are heart-shaped, so we can call that cordate. Specifically, the base is cordate, and the tip is sort of acuminate a little bit, kind of pointy. It is smooth, it doesn't have any hairs, and this tree in the early spring is probably the most beautiful thing. It has a big pile of light purple flowers that cover the trunks and the branches, and they're really lovely. It's quite common in our area. You'll see it on the side of the road, particularly in the springtime when it's blooming. All right, this is winged elm, or Ulmus alata. It's in the elm family, Ulmaceae. It is usually a small tree, but it can also be pretty shrubby. It's very common in our area, particularly in roadsides and sort of waste areas, because it It tolerates a wide variety of conditions. So the specific name alata means winged. And when we say winged, we mean these quirky outgrowths on the stem that sometimes make it look like it has little winged outgrowths. The prevalence of the wings depends a lot on the individual. You'll see a lot of these twigs don't have any wings, but some specimens will have a lot of quirky outgrowth. We will make sure that you have a piece with quirky outgrowth on your quiz. The leaves are alternately arranged. They are generally elliptic in shape. They're a little bit rough on the surface, and this is the first of our leaves that is doubly serrate. You can see that the leaf margins have big serrations, and then each of the big serrations have smaller serrations on it. And that's characteristic of this particular small tree. In addition, the base of the leaves tends to be slightly asymmetrical, which is called being oblique. So it's got a slightly oblique base with very short petioles. All right, this is another usually small tree. This is the southern sugar maple. That's going to be Acer floridanum. So not to be confused with Acer saccharum, which is the northern sugar maple, which we don't get in this area. So first thing you'll notice is that these leaves are opposite. So there's going to be two leaves at each node. They have very long, slender petioles, and the leaves themselves are palmately lobed. So they are lobed, all spreading out from this single point here. Later on, we're going to compare it to a red maple, and one of the best ways to tell is if you look at these deep sinuses here. The sinuses on the southern sugar maple form U shapes. So you can see that it's sort of rounded. They also have no hairs. They are very smooth, and the points themselves are sort of neat and tidy. Not a lot of teeth and serrations. They're like a little bit rounded. So the upper side of the leaf is sort of a little bit shiny, and the underside is just a lighter green. So this is a very common understory tree, particularly in areas that have a little better soil, so a little bit of calcium in the soil. All right, this is our next maple, our second maple. This is Acer rubrum, also in the family Aceraceae or Sapindaceae, whichever nomenclature you choose to use is fine. Like the southern sugar maple, it has opposite leaves. So we can see that right here. These two leaves are coming from one point on the stem. This one has three for some reason, but usually there's going to be opposite leaves. They also have very long, slender petioles, and the leaves are palmately lobed. So all the lobes are extending from the base here of the leaf. You'll notice, however, that the sinuses are V-shaped. So if you can see at the bottom of that sinus, it's shaped like a V. It's not rounded. Around the margins, they don't have those sort of slender rounded points. They've got sharp jaggedy teeth. There's usually three main lobes and then these large sort of doubly serrate kind of teeth around the edge. This is probably one of the most common trees in our area. It grows absolutely everywhere. It is tolerant of every condition, and the only thing it doesn't like is fire. And with no fire on the landscape, this tends to increase in number. And so you will find this everywhere. This is, however, that beautiful tree that you see in the fall because the leaves turn bright red, and in the spring the flowers are red. So it's a very ornamental tree as well. Also, as a note, when you flip it over, the underside tends to be this sort of glaucous color. It's usually whiter and lighter colored with more of a blue tint than you see in Acer floridanum. All right, this is another small tree to large tree. Usually around here it doesn't get very big, and you often see it sort of in roadsides and scrubby areas because it, like the winged elm, tolerates a lot of conditions. This is white ash, Fraxinus, Fraxinus americana, and it is in the olive family, Oleaceae. It, like many members of its family, have opposite leaves, so you'll see that each node there are two leaves. The terminal bud is also pretty characteristic. It's often this sort of stumpy pyramid shape. The leaves themselves are compound. They usually have 7 leaflets, so it's pretty reliable. And this is going to be the only thing that we look at that has pinnately compound leaves and opposite leaves. So as a reminder, to decide whether, is this a leaflet or a leaf? The way we do this is by looking to see at the base whether there's a bud. So if you look at the base of the leaflet, there's no bud. If we look at the base of the full leaf, however, there is a little bud there. That's an axial bud. So at the base of every leaf on a woody plant is going to be a bud. If you don't see the bud, that means you're looking at a leaflet and not a leaf. All right, this is another small tree that can get pretty big, but around here you usually see pretty small and scrubby. It's very weedy. This is Prunus serotina, or black cherry. It is in the Rosaceae family, or the rose family. And when you look at the flowers, you'll be able to see that, but it's the wrong time of year for flowers. And this individual is too young for that anyways. So it's got alternate leaves, so you can see that at each node there's just a single leaf popping out. The leaves themselves are super nondescript. They're just sort of elliptical with fine serrations along the margins. If you remember Viburnum prunifolium, the black haw, they're very similar. And that's why they call it prunifolium, because it reminds them of the prunus leaf, so Prunus serotina. The leaves are glabrous on both sides, so no hairs on the top, no hairs on the bottom. What they do have are these weird paired glands sort of at the top of the petiole, and it's going to be hard to see, we'll get you a close-up later. So they're on either side of the petiole here, and that's very characteristic of members of Prunus. They have served various purposes, often to invite ants over. So this tree does produce fruit. They aren't very good to eat, but birds really like them. And so birds swallow the berries whole and then poop the seeds out all over the place. And so it's a very common tree because the birds like it. Another characteristic that is less apparent on this young one is that there are horizontal striations along the stems and trunks that make it look like it has horizontal stripes. When it gets bigger, sometimes they can get to be very long stripes. They're called lenticels. They're sort of quirky openings in the bark. But you can see them a little bit here as kind of these lighter spots. So boring leaf-shaped leaves, no hairs, alternate leaves, spots and striations on the stem, and these sort of fine serrations along the margins. And that is your black cherry, or Prunus serotina. This is an eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana. It's our first conifer. It's in the family Cupressaceae, or the cypress family. It is very common in our area, and it is very distinct. You will not have any trouble telling us apart from any other plant. It's usually a small tree, but it can be kind of shrubby. It tolerates some weird conditions though, so sometimes you see it growing in unusual soil conditions or areas that are quite dry with unusual soil conditions. We'll give you a close-up of this, but the leaves have been reduced to tiny scales. So they are so tiny, and they are all folded together like the scales on a snake along this stem here. So the photosynthetic parts are not, they're not slim and sort of wide outgrowths the way we see with other plants. They're just these little tiny green scales. This plant has unusual developmental growth in that when it's a baby, the very young leaves are super spiky. And this is to prevent herbivores from eating it because it's uncomfortable. When it gets older, you get the leaves that are like this, these scales that wrap around the stem. So this is not as spiky and would be better to eat if you were a deer. However, if it was super young, it would be very spiky, but we don't have any of those here right now. It has very unusual fruit. The female cones are blue and look like berries. You've probably seen them. The wood, this is not actually closely related to what we think of as cedar, as a true cedar, but it does have lovely fragrant red wood. So if you ever have to chop one of these down in your yard, make sure you keep some of that wood because you can use it as, you know, a moth repellent, and it smells beautifully like cedar. All right, this is a younger red cedar, and you can see that the leaves here are still needles. They're very sharp and uncomfortable, and I am sacrificing for the sake of this video. So these would not be delicious for a deer to eat. They're kind of pointy, but when they get older, it develops those scale-like leaves, which are less pointy. All right, this is the first of many oak trees that we're going to be learning. We are learning quite a few today, and there'll be an additional one in a couple weeks. So the first one is probably the most archetypal oak of all. This is white oak, or Quercus alba. All the oaks are in Fagaceae, so they're in the same family as the beech tree. That whole family has very distinctive types of fruit that you'll learn more about later on. In oaks, those fruit are called acorns, and you guys definitely know what those look like. So when we look at oaks as a whole, we divide them into two main groups, the white oaks and the red oaks. The white oaks have rounded lobes. This one's a little bit beat up, but you can see that each lobe on the leaf is round. If we look at the red oaks, which I'll show you in a second, they have a little spike or hair at the end called an awn. So for the white oaks, these are very common trees. They grow in a lot of different environments, and they have very distinctive sort of pale, platy bark. The easiest way, though, is you look for something with rounded tips on the leaves, and then you look at the underside, which is going to be pale. So it's got a glaucous underside that's sort of bluish-greenish. And it's the only oak we've got that does that, so it's very easy to identify. All right, this is another member of the white oak group. This one is called post oak, or Quercus stellata. And again, it's in Fagaceae, or the beech family. So this one is also in the white oak group because you can see if you look at the outsides of the lobes, there's no little bristle tips or hairs on the tips of the lobes. Post oak is very different though. It has sort of thicker leathery leaves. On the underside, it's got hairs. We'll try and give you a close-up. The specific name of this stellata is not referring to the shape, that means star. It's not referring to the shape of the leaf, it's referring to the shape of the hairs. If you were to look at them under a microscope, you would see the hairs are star-shaped. So the overall shape is kind of like a cross. There's usually sort of a long part down here, a short part up here, and then a larger sort of crossbar here. The shape varies quite a bit, and it will also depend upon whether it's a younger or a more mature species. These guys are common, but also tend to grow in slightly drier environments because they tolerate it better. Now we're into the red oak group. So the red oaks have bristle tips at the ends of the lobes, and they're very visible on this, this leaf right here. So always look for the bristle tips to figure out which group of oaks we're talking about. Specifically, this is a northern red oak, or Quercus rubra. It is more common north of here, and in our area it tends to grow in more moist environments. And it doesn't like fire as much as the other oaks. So it has pinnate lobes, but again, those lobes have the bristle tips, so it's usually pretty easy to identify. The underside doesn't have any hairs except sometimes in the armpits of the veins. So if you look at the axil between the primary and secondary vein here, there are some little hairs there. But in general, it's pretty glabrous, and it can be kind of shiny like you see here. One characteristic that we see in all oaks that's nicely visible here is this big pile of terminal buds. So the terminal bud, there's usually just one terminal bud on a branch. Oaks often have several of them piled together. So if you see a twig where there are a bunch of terminal buds, it's probably an oak. All right, this is another member of the red oak family. This is the black oak, Quercus velutina. Velutina means velvety, and this has some velvety hairs on the underside of the petiole and the leaf. They're not always super visible, but one way to tell this one from the northern red oak, which it sometimes can resemble, is to check the underside and see where those hairs are. There are a lot more hairs on the underside of velutina. So these particular black oak leaves are shade leaves. You'll see that these shade leaves from the northern red oak, or these are not such shade leaves. They have less fine leaves, these have more divisions. These are kind of fatter. But if you look at the very ends of those lobes, like here you can see one, it's got a little tiny hair on it. So we can tell it's in the red oak family. And the velvety underside tells us that it is a black oak. So Quercus velutina. This is also another oak that grows in all sorts of different environments. This is another member of the red oak group. This is the southern red oak, or Quercus falcata. Falcata means falcate, which means it's curved sort of like a scimitar, and this leaf really does that. So you can see that that mid-vein kind of curves off to one side, and so you get this weird asymmetrical look in the lobing. That's very characteristic of this particular species. As a note, oak trees have sun and shade leaves. When they grow in the shade, they tend to be much fatter with less lobing. These are sun leaves. You can see they're very stretched out, very long, narrow lobes. So we will try and clarify that at a later point. So Quercus falcata has a little bit of hair on the underside, but more characteristic is this shape here. You'll see it's still got those bristle tips. This one here is very long. It is common in pretty much all environments in our area. It's also a good example also of those multiple terminal buds that you see here. So if you just see these terminal buds, even if there were no leaves, you would be able to tell that it's an oak. This is the last of the oaks that we're doing this week. This is a super weird one. This is the willow oak, or Quercus fellows. So it is weird because you'll notice there are no lobes at all, or it kind of has just one lobe. It's in the red oak group. You can see it has a little bristle tip at the end, very end of each leaf, but the leaf doesn't have lobes. The name willow oak is because sometimes people think these look like willow leaves because they're sort of long and narrow, almost linear. They're very long and narrow. In the wild, this oak grows in sort of wet places like seeps and sometimes near rivers and areas where the water collects. Tolerates the wet very well. However, its range is much wider due to it being planted very often in cities. It's a very fast-growing oak, and so people grow it as a shade tree a lot. You will see this absolutely everywhere. However, they grow fast, and they're not particularly long-lived for oaks. Oaks usually live a long time. This one does not. That's about it for this guy. If you see an oak, so it's still got those kind of leathery oak leaves, and if you look close, none of these are good examples. If you look close, it'll still have those multiple terminal buds. They're just much smaller and harder to see. But if you see a plant with these long, narrow leaves and it's a tree, it's going to be a willow oak. Now we're into a new group of plants. We have two hickory trees that we're going to be looking at. These tend to be pretty large trees. They're in Juglandaceae family, that's the walnut family, and they have nuts that are pretty similar to walnuts if you've ever seen a hickory nut. So, hickory trees, Caria, have alternate leaves. It's a little hard to see here, but that means that there's one leaf at each node. Some of the nodes are very close. Might be easier to see from this side. You can see there's a leaf and there's a leaf. They often have very large terminal buds, but that's usually more apparent in the winter. So this one is mockernut hickory. This is Caria tomentosa. Tomentose is a type of hair. It means sort of fuzzy, woolly hair. And this has fuzzy, woolly, tomentose hairs all the way up the petiole, the undersides of the leaves, the rachis, everything. So that's how you're going to be able to tell this. So it has compound leaves that are alternately arranged, that are fuzzy on the underside. They usually have about 7 leaflets, like this, with the 3 terminal leaflets usually being quite a bit larger. Sometimes they have up to 9 leaflets, but 7 is usually what I see. The twigs themselves are pretty thick. You'll see this is a pretty sturdy twig, particularly when we compare it to our next hickory. This is our next hickory. This is pignut hickory, or Caria glabra, still in Juglandaceae. You'll notice that this is a very different looking hickory. It has much smaller leaflets, and there's usually only 5. So you can see on this leaf here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, those terminal leaflets tend to be larger. One of the main differences when you just look at the leaf is that it is glabrous, meaning it doesn't have any hairs. So there's no hair on the underside of the petiole, rachis, or leaves. So as a result, it can sometimes look a little bit shiny because it doesn't have that fuzz on it. The twigs themselves are also more slender than the other hickory. So you can see this is the Caria glabra twig, and this is the Caria tomentosa twig. So again, another hickory, alternately arranged leaves. So you see alternate, 2, 3. Compound leaves with usually 5 leaflets, and no hairs on the underside. This guy is the American persimmon, or Diospyros virginiana. It's in the ebony family, Eboniaceae. This family are a lot of small trees, and this one is no exception. It has very, very hard wood, and so it's been very popular for making things like musical instruments sometimes. It has extremely nondescript leaves. They're just sort of vaguely elliptical with entire margins, and they're just green. So how do we tell this apart from other very boring leaves? Well, we flip it over, and you'll see that the underside is kind of bluish white. If you get a close-up, you can see there's a very characteristic pattern on these leaves. We'll get it in photograph. And so that's how you can identify this. So if you see a leaf that is elliptic or just sort of vaguely leaf-shaped, turn it over and see if it's kind of whitish or bluish green underneath. It's probably a persimmon. The leaves themselves are arranged alternately, And so we can tell this is one whole leaf because there's a bud right in that leaf axil. This particular tree is known mostly for its fruit. This one is unripe, but when it ripens it gets a little bit bigger and turns sort of a pinky, orangey, peachy color. They're super delicious, but do not harvest them until after the first frost, because otherwise they are too sour to eat. But the birds and other wildlife love these trees, so they are planted often for wildlife purposes. So this is a plant that you have almost certainly seen on campus and a lot around here. This is southern magnolia, or Magnolia grandiflora. So this, in the spring and summer, has gigantic white, beautiful flowers, and it's very sort of emblematic of the South, and so you see it planted everywhere. Its geographic range is actually expanding quite a bit because people are planting it. The way you identify this is that, first of all, it's got these big, leathery, shiny leaves. Technically, they are arranged alternately along the stem. You'll see that each node only has one leaf, but towards the tip of the branch, the nodes are very close together. The undersides of the leaves have this sort of rusty orangish hairs on them, and they will also rub off if you sort of, well, this one's not rubbing off. They also will rub off. One of the key traits of the whole magnolia family that you see a lot are what are basically the scars that are left by the stipules. The stipules wrap all the way around the stem, so you get these what we call circumferential stipular scars. That's this dark line here that is underneath every leaf, and it wraps all the way around in a circle around the whole stem. So that is a dead giveaway that you're looking at Magnolia ace. This what is here, this is the fruit. This is an aggregate fruit. We'll talk about that later in Fruit Lab, so you don't need to worry about that, but this one happens to have a fruit. And you can see the remnants of the other flower parts here.
The bud on the other one?
Oh yeah, we do have the buds. The terminal buds, when you can see them, are valvate. Sort of, they're kind of like a duckbill. There's two halves that smoosh together like that. Our next plant is a shrub. This is another viburnum. This is maple leaf viburnum, which is Viburnum acerifolium. Acer, as we've learned by now, is the genus for maples, so this is literally the maple leaf viburnum. Like all viburnums, with very few exceptions, it has oppositely arranged leaves, so there's going to be two leaves at every node. And the way to tell this apart from a regular maple is by how fuzzy it is. In close-up images, you can see those hairs very clearly. It's got hairs both on the upper and lower surface, and they're very soft. So the general shape is very similar to maples in that it has these larger lobes as well as extra teeth along the edges. You'll see, however, that the petioles are much shorter than we see with the actual maples. So regular maples had those extremely long, slender petioles. These petioles are more reasonably long. As I mentioned, this is a shrub, so it's going to be growing in the understory of forests, particularly forests with a little more nutrients in the soil. It also produces very pretty white flowers in the spring and dark black berries later on. The birds have gotten them all at this point, and they're very popular with birds as a result. Our next plant is an herb. So this plant does not grow a woody stem, and this is about as big as it gets. It grows from sort of a rosette of basal leaves, but never develops cauline leaves like some herbs do. This is heartleaf arrowleaf. Its Latin name is Hexastylus erifolia. Erifolia means arrow-leaved, which you can see by the shape of the leaves. Hexastylus means that the flower has 6 styles, which unfortunately we will not be able to see here because it is generally the wrong time of year to see the flowers, which are very inconspicuous and often under the leaves. So This is in the Aristolochiaceae family, or the birthwort family. We're going to learn several members of this family. Sometimes this is also called a kind of wild ginger because sort of the roots kind of smell like ginger sometimes. More likely though, the base of them smells more like licorice. We've got several species of Hexastylus, but this is the most common one. The way you'll be able to ID this one in comparison to the one that we'll learn next week is that the leaves themselves have these earlobe shaped bases. So it's not like a pure heart, it tends to have more earlobe bases. And more specifically, you'll notice that the dark green follows the venation, and then there are white blotches between the veins. So dark green on the veins, light green between the veins. What else we got? Aristolochiaceae is a group of relatively primitive plants. And these in particular are fun because they are ant pollinated. As I mentioned, the flowers are kind of down below and they entice ants over. And then the ants will also disperse the seeds. So they pick up the seeds, which have a little delicious nutrient packet on them. The ants take them home to their nest, and then those seeds get deposited into the rubbish heap in the anthill, and then the baby plant has a big pile of fertilizer to work with when it grows. So because ants don't travel very far, these spread pretty slowly. But the good news is that they've had enough time and they are now everywhere. It's a very common understory plant in most of our woods. So Hexastylus erifolia, and that's in Aristolochiaceae. All right, our next plant is a tree called sweet gum. It is not related to many other things that are called gum trees, like we're going to learn a black gum. Gum was just a term that they tended to apply to trees that had very sticky sap. In this case, don't worry about it. Its common name is sweet gum, but its Latin name is liquidambar styraciflua. I am not entirely sure what those all mean. I might add that in later. Some of these are kind of weird looking, but usually the leaves are pretty regularly palmately lobed. So you'll see it has 5 points. So there's 5 lobes. The lobes themselves have smaller, sort of gentle serrations on them. And you'll see that the venation follows the lobe shape too, so they are palmately lobed and palmately veined. They are arranged alternately along the stem, so you can see there's only 1 leaf at each node. And as a tree, it tends to be another one of those trees that grows in sort of waste spaces and along the sides of roads. It's very tough. It can stand a whole lot of conditions. One unusual thing about it is that sometimes it will produce corky outgrowth on the stems and bark like we see in the winged elm, and so you can see some of that here as well. Again, like with the winged elm, it depends on the individual as to whether you'll see that, so it's not always a good identifying feature. That's about it. The fruit of this is this fascinating sort of cluster of capsules that are together, and you've probably seen them. A lot of people call them gumballs. They become a menace. I'll get another picture of that too that we can get a better view of. I'll just take another still. They're a menace if you like to walk barefoot in the yard, but they're pretty cool to look at. And that's it for the sweet gum, which is in the Altingia family called Altingiaceae, and it's the only thing you're going to learn in this class in that family. So our next plant is a woody plant that tends to be a small tree, but most of the time in our area you're going to see it growing as a shrub, sometimes a very large shrub. This is American holly, Ilex opaca. It is in the holly family, which is Aquifoliaceae. This is one of our first plants that we've seen, other than magnolia, that is evergreen. Just to make sure that you understand the difference between evergreen and a conifer, conifers are a taxonomic group, whereas evergreen is just a description of how the leaves are. Deciduous trees shed their leaves in the fall in temperate climates, whereas evergreen plants, woody plants that are evergreen, keep their leaves. They invest a lot more into the leaf itself, and so they are very sturdy and leathery most of the time. The holly here is extra invested in its leaves in that it has developed these spines around the margins of the leaves. They are quite sharp and uncomfortable, and that deters mammalian herbivores like deer. Deer tend not to very much like this particular plant because it hurts their mouth. So the leaves themselves are arranged alternately on the stem, so just 1 leaf per node. And this is the only plant that we're going to look at that has these spines around the leaf tissue. Again, leaves are evergreen, leathery, spiny. And this is the holly that is sort of emblematic of the winter season and Christmas in particular. It is a dioecious plant in that males and females are separate plants. So it's only the female plants that grow those pretty red berries. But when you do find them, they're quite lovely if you can get them before the birds do. So American holly, Ilex opaca, in the holly family Aquifoliaceae. Our next plant is Muscadinia rotundifolia. It is the muscadine grape, or sometimes called scuppernong. It is like the Virginia creeper. It is in the grape family, Vitaceae. The leaves are pretty characteristic. They have a cordate base and are sort of roughly round. They do, however, have some very large teeth and have kind of a crenate margin, so they're sort of rounded a little bit. It is a vine, like many members of its family, and the purpose of being a vine is to sneak up to the treetops where there's light without having to invest in a woody trunk. This will develop a woody vine when it gets big enough, but for the most part you will be seeing it as this more herbaceous looking thing with softer tissue. It grows modified leaves that are tendrils at some of these nodes, and you'll see that what differentiates Muscadinia as a genus from Vitis, which is the regular grape genus, is that these tendrils don't branch off. They are single, simple tendrils, just one long tendril. And so they use that to wrap around and climb up other plants to get to the sunlight without having to become a tree. These do produce a very delicious fruit. It's a very large grape. There are usually some you can try down near the bottom of the Forest Theater if you ever are curious and want to beat the birds. They're delicious, but they have a lot of seeds in them. So our next tree is another understory tree. It's usually fairly small, but it can sometimes get pretty big. This individual, the main trunk, is quite large. This is sourwood, Oxydendrum arboreum. For some reason, this is an understory tree that almost never grows straight up. A lot of times it will start out its life growing straight up, but then something will knock it over. So you almost always see it growing at a weird angle like this. It is in the Ericaceae, or the heather family. It is unusual in that it's the only Ericaceae tree that we're going to be seeing in this particular course. Most members of Ericaceae around here are shrubs or sometimes herbs. So it has alternately arranged leaves, so one leaf per node. The leaves themselves are pretty nondescript. They have a very short petiole. The leaves are a very bright green, and they are usually slightly ovate, but mostly elliptical. Fairly long though. The margins have these very sort of minute serrations, and if you look very close, sometimes they kind of look hairy. For the most part, there's not a lot of hair on these leaves, but the underside along the midvein often has a few sparse hairs. My favorite thing about this tree is that it is tasty. This tree produces oxalic acid in its leaves, which is an herbivore deterrent. Mostly insect herbivores don't like it, but it doesn't hurt people, and it means that you can sort of munch the end of the leaf, and it's like sour and tangy. So it's a nice refreshing sort of nibble while you're walking. So my favorite way of diagnosing this plant, once I think I have found one, is I take a piece of leaf off and I gnarm on it. And if it tastes sort of tangy sour, definitely a sourwood. The name is very correct here. Next we have another member of Ericaceae, the heath family. This is lowbush blueberry. This is Vaccinium pallidum. Pallidum means pale or light colored, and you'll notice that the undersides of the leaves are much paler. Well, it's not as pale. These are not particularly pale on the underside. Usually it does have sort of a whitish bluish cast to the underside, so kind of glaucous on the undersides of the leaves. This is officially about as tall as it ever gets. It doesn't really get more than about 18 inches tall, so the name is very appropriate. We don't have too many very small blueberries, but this is the main one that you see around here. It's very common in a lot of different kinds of woods. Blueberries in general, and also other members of its family, have symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil that allow it to live in places with acidic soils, which have fewer nutrients available. So those fungi help it yank those nutrients out of uncooperative soils, and it allows these guys to thrive. So identifying this guy, you'll notice that the leaves are quite small. They are still alternately arranged on the stem, but the stems are green. The stems are green and photosynthetic, usually all the way down to the base. So you can see they're green even down there. I'm not entirely sure what the benefit is. It may allow them to do some extra photosynthesis during the winter. They're deciduous, so their leaves do drop off in the winter, but photosynthetic stems might allow them to get a little head start in the spring. The margins of the leaves are what we call ciliate. You'll be able to see it in the close-up. They have such tiny serrations that they're kind of like hairs. Kind of interesting. So as far as leaf size goes, this is about the biggest you're ever going to see for Vaccinium pallidum. So maybe about the size of a quarter, but mostly quite a bit smaller. Like other blueberries, they produce a very delicious fruit, but it can be a challenge to find them because basically as soon as they're ripe, all the animals in the woods come and eat them all. But if you can get them, they're really good. They're usually ripe in early May, late April in our area. Very tasty, a lot of seeds, but super good. All right, our next tree has some of the most nondescript leaves of the things that we're looking at. This is Nyssa sylvatica, or black gum. It is in the Nysaceae family, so it has its own family that it hangs out in. And it also has alternate leaves, like many of the things we're looking at. It tends to hang out in the understory, but it does get pretty good sized in some forests. It has very nondescript sort of leaf-shaped leaves, except you'll notice that the widest point is towards the tip. That particular shape is called obovate, sort of like opposite egg-shaped, where the base of the egg is towards the tip. They also tend to have this little drip tip. You can see there's a little sort of extra long, narrow tip at the end, and that'll help get in moist climates that get a lot of rain. That's very common because that helps get the water off the leaf quickly when it rains so that it doesn't rot. Some of these have very unusual leaves, and I saw a few. Every once in a while you get leaves that have extra like points on them. I don't know what triggers that, but it's not uncommon. So you will see that every once in a while. So yes, alternate simple leaves. They tend to have this pretty short petiole once you get to the leaf, so these aren't as short as some. So this very tall tree here that has been knocked over a bit but is also very, very straight is a tulip tree, also known as a tulip poplar. It is not a poplar, however, so tulip tree is probably the best common name for you to use. Its Latin name is Liriodendron tulipifera, so its specific name just means bearing tulips. It's called that because in the spring it has these beautiful, vaguely tulip-shaped flowers. The flowers are very showy, which is something that's common for members of its family because it is in the Magnoliaceae, like that magnolia that we saw earlier. It is unmistakable, however, because the leaves themselves have 4 lobes. It is the only plant that we have on our list that regularly has an even number of lobes. So the leaves themselves are arranged alternately along the stem. It has a very cool bud. If you remember that valvate bud from the magnolia, this also has a valvate bud. What's cool though is that it also has these stipules that still hang around. Often the stipules of plants will fall off. They're deciduous once the leaves come out, but sometimes they hang around. So these stipules are what are producing that circumferential stipular scar that we see in members of the magnolia family. And the scar is this line right at the base of the stipule, and there would be another stipule on the other side. So that line would run all the way around the stem, and it's a dead giveaway that you're dealing with the magnolia family. So this is a very common tree in our area. It grows very quickly, and it also grows very straight. So if you see a tree in the forest around here that shoots straight up to the canopy, doesn't have many lower branches, this is kind of unusual, and often kind of looks like a Q-tip. You know, it's got this long, tall, straight stem and then a poof of leaves at the top. It's very common for this tree. It's often thought of as an early successional tree because it grows very quickly in the sunlight, but it doesn't outcompete other things very well. So again, tulip tree, Liriodendron, in the family of Magnoliaceae. Here we have a plant that is very familiar to some of you probably. This is poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans. It is in the cashew family, Anacardiaceae. We've got several members of that family, and it's pretty common for members of that family to be toxic or irritating in some fashion. Many of them are poisonous to eat. This one produces a very specific oil on its leaves called urushiol, and that's what causes the rash in most people. I spent most of my youth covered in poison ivy every summer. Then I thought I got over it, and very recently I discovered that no, I'm still allergic. So please, if you spot this in the woods, don't touch it. The way you identify it is that it is usually a shrubby vine, like you see here. It kind of looks shrubby. Or sometimes you'll see it run up trees, and it has sort of a thick brown woody vine that looks almost furry. It has adventitious roots that grow along the sides of the stem, and those are what it uses to cling as it climbs. So the old rhyme goes, leaves of 3 let it be, berries white, a poisonous sight, and then something about the furry vine. You don't ever see the berries because they're all the way up at the treetops, but leaflets would be more correct because these are compound leaves. These are compound leaves. They are, I believe they are palmately trifoliate, but it's hard to tell because I'm not going to touch them and get a good look, but you'll notice that there are 3 leaflets. The one in the center is roughly symmetrical, whereas the 2 lateral leaflets kind of have a thumb sticking out. So it's like there's a thumb on the basal side. And that's probably the best way to ID this, is that those lateral leaflets always have a bit of a thumb. So, all right, our next plant is called Virginia creeper, Parthenocissus quinquifolia. Quinquifolia means 5 leaves, and you'll notice it has 5 leaflets. These are compound leaves that are palmately compound, so you can see all the leaflets are coming off of a single point. The leaflets themselves have some sort of rough dentition, and you'll notice that a lot of them often have those thumb leaves like you see with the poison ivy. But for the most part, adult Virginia creeper leaves have 5 leaflets. Babies often have 3. You can see this is a growing vine and they only have 3 leaflets. If you see this in the wild, don't touch it because it might well be poison ivy, but we can see that it's not from this particular individual. So the leaves themselves are arranged alternately along the stem. Virginia creeper is in the grape family, Vitaceae. It's the first of our Vitaceae members that we're going to look at. A lot of things in that family are vines, and this is no exception. What we're seeing here is in its sort of shrubby form. When it finds something it can climb, it climbs right up it. It grows interesting adventitious roots at each node, and they have lots of little tendrils on them, each of which has a sticky pad at the end of it. Those glue on to whatever it's climbing and help it get its way up to get sun from the treetops. Our next plant is a small tree called pawpaw. It is a Simina triloba. It is in a mostly tropical family called Ananaceae, or the custard apple family. Ananaceae is mostly present in the tropics and is known for producing a lot of big, interesting fruits. And pawpaw is no exception. It grows in temperate areas here, but it does produce a big, sweet, interesting fruit if you're here at the right time of year and you're around plants that are actually producing fruit. This plant has very large leaves. You can see the size compared to my hand. I have a normal sized hand. They are obovate, meaning that they're wider towards the tip. They have a little bit of a drip tip. As we mentioned, the drip tip is common in areas where there's plenty of rain, because if the rain sticks onto the leaf for too long, it can promote fungal infections. So it wants to get that rain off the leaf as soon as possible. The leaves have fairly short petioles, as you can see here, and the terminal bud is very characteristic. You can see it's this sort of rusty color, and it doesn't have any bulbs, it doesn't have any bud scales or valves or anything. It's just naked. It's the only plant that we're going to really be looking at that has a bud like this. So rusty orange terminal bud that's slightly fuzzy and doesn't have any protection. It's naked bud. So this plant is common. It's usually kind of near water. It likes moist areas, and it's a clonal plant. If you look around this whole area, all of these things that you see with big leaves, those are all members, those are all individuals that are connected underground. So they are all clones of the same genetic individual. So genetic diversity can be a weird thing to calculate with this guy, as well as identifying a single plant. Because for the most part, you're going to find these in patches, where they are all clones of the same singular genome. but it also means that if you can find a good patch that's producing fruit, you can get a lot of fruit out of it. If we were teaching this class in person, I would crunch up one of these leaves and let you sniff it, because they smell kind of like green bell pepper, which I find repugnant, but some people don't mind. So again, this is pawpaw, Asimina triloba, one of my favorite sort of moist forest trees around here. All right, this is another herb. This one is more of an annual, and so this guy is going to die back and then potentially regrow from seed the next year. So it's called false nettle, and the Latin name is Bommeria cylindrica. Cylindrica refers to the shape of the inflorescences, but we can't see that actually on this particular friend here. So the leaves, as you'll see, are opposite. So there's two at every node. The inflorescences do grow in the axils of the leaves when they're present. This guy just doesn't have any mature ones. So the shape of the leaves is ovate, so shaped like an egg. It has an acuminate tip. This one's broken off. One of the key features that you'll see is that at the base of the leaf, it splits into 3 main veins. Those will split further on, but those 3 main veins at the base are pretty characteristic. It also has very even, sort of large serrations that go up the margins of it. It has a little bit of a rough feel, and there are some hairs here and there. What else did I want to say about it? It has very long petioles. The petioles are sometimes almost as big as the leaves are, so you can see that very long petiole there. So opposite leaves, simple leaves, ovate, with this long acuminate tip. It's in the nettle family, Urticaceae, but as the name false nettle implies, it is not actually stinging. It doesn't have those urticating hairs, which are what gives you the bad reaction with an actual nettle. That's about it for this guy. You'll notice that these upper veins are sort of pushed into the leaf, so it looks a little quilted sometimes. That can be another good way to identify it. Our next plant is a small to large tree that is naturally not really located in our area. This is the big leaf magnolia, which is Magnolia macrophylla. The name macrophylla means big leaf, so it is a well-named plant. It is usually found in other areas, but there's a specimen in the Arboretum. And so the thought is that this particular individual, who has a few clones around here, this individual escaped, seeded here, and now has a small colony right here in Battle Park. So the name is very apt. You can see, compared to my fairly normal-sized hand, the leaves are enormous. They vary a bit, but these are about as big as the mature leaves are. So they are obovate, so they're going to be slightly wider towards the tip, and they have what's called an auriculate leaf base. So that means that, like the Hexastylus aerifolia, they have little earlobe bases down here, sort of little flaps of tissue that extend out beyond where the petiole joins the leaf. Like other members of Magnoliaceae, it has those circumferential stipular scars, which you can see when you zoom in on the tip there. For the most part, the leaves will be clustered at the ends of branches, and so you get this kind of umbrella effect going on here. In fact, there's another magnolia that we're not learning in this class called umbrella magnolia, which has the same sort of arrangement of leaves. They are alternate, but they are so crowded at the end of the stems that you can sometimes not really tell. The buds, we've got a convenient bud down here, you'll notice are very similar to the other buds that we've seen from Magnoliaceae. They're large and they're valvate in that they have 2 bits of tissue on either side that enclose the bud and keep it protected until it develops. The undersides of the leaves are quite glaucous, so that's sort of bluish white, and they are a little bit fuzzy down there too. And so this is a very difficult plant to mistake for anything else because of the size of the mature leaves. I don't think we're going to be really looking at anything else that has leaves this big other than a palm. So Magnolia macrophylla, or the big leaf magnolia. Our next plant is a fern. So it's a vascular plant, but it's not a seed plant. You'll learn more about that in class when we hit the fern portion of the lectures. So this is Christmas fern, Polystichum acrosticoides. It is in the Dryopteridaceae, or the wood fern family, And it's one of my favorite native ferns. This group right here was planted, but it is a native species and it's very common. So it is an evergreen fern, meaning that in the dead of winter, you will still see this fern. A lot of times in the winter, it will flatten its leaves out, and that helps sort of keep it warm because it can absorb the sunlight, but also stay close to the warmer ground. So in winter, it doesn't stick up as much, but it's still green. And that's one of the reasons why, one of the potential reasons why it's called Christmas fern, because it's one of the few green things that's around during Christmas time. Another reason they think that it's called Christmas fern is if you pull off one of the pinnae, it either looks like a sled, like Santa's sled, or a Christmas stocking. So those are three potential reasons for the common name. But you can just be more accurate and call it Polystichum acrostichoides. So, as I mentioned, it's evergreen. You don't really need to worry about the leaf arrangement because you can't see the stem. It's herbaceous, it doesn't have a woody stem, but it has these basally oriented leaves. It doesn't develop a stalk with calling leaves. So they're all coming from basically one point in the ground. In the spring, when it's starting to grow a few new leaves, its leaves don't die back in the winter fully, but in the spring it will usually regrow a few to replace some that have been beat up over the years. So as it is a fern, it reproduces via spores, and you can see the sporangia, which are sort of the spore-bearing structures, and they develop on the undersides of some of the pinnules that are towards the tip of the leaf. So this is one entire leaf. It is a compound leaf because it is divided. Each of these is a leaflet. In ferns, we sometimes call them pinnules or pinnae, depending upon whose nomenclature you're using. So some of these leaves are not producing sporangia. The leaves that produce sporangia often have these little stunted leaflets towards the tip, and that's where you'll find the orange sporangia on the underside. The leaves themselves, because they're evergreen, they're a little bit leathery. But overall, it's a very easy fern to identify because its leaves are pinnately compound, but only once. So they're divided into single leaflets. It's evergreen, they're leathery, and it's a fern. Our next plant is another shrub, and it's another viburnum. This is the downy arrowwood, Viburnum raffinesquianum. Raffinesquianum is just named after a botanist named Rafinesque, who's a French dude. So like the rest of the viburnums that we've learned, the leaves are arranged oppositely, so two at each node. They are not quite as soft and velvety as the maple leaf viburnum, but still quite velvety on the underside. So this side is quite soft. So the shape of the leaves is usually pretty obovate, so it's going to be wider, towards the lower half of the leaf. These are not great leaves. Usually, this is a better one. So the leaves have sort of large, irregular serrations that are more towards the tip than the base. Sometimes sometimes the margins are entire towards the base of the leaf, but they will have at least some larger serrations towards the apex of the leaf. Like other members of its genus, it produces very wildlife popular berries, but if this one produced any, they are long gone because they get snapped up pretty quickly. While this is a native species, you also see it planted ornamentally because it produces those pretty flower and fruit. So again, this is Viburnum raffinesquianum, and differentiating it from other things, it's got opposite leaves, fairly short petioles, velvety underside, generally obovate leaves with a long tip, and those large teeth that go up the sort of the tip end of that leaf there. This is our last tree for this week. This is usually a small understory tree, but sometimes they get pretty large like this one. This is the southern hackberry, also known as the sugarberry, or Celtis levigata. It is in Canadensis, which is the marijuana family. It does not have any of those psychoactive chemicals in it though, so don't get too excited. So this particular tree tends to grow in forests that have richer soil, so they often have some calcium and are not as acidic. So the best way to ID this one is if you get a big example, you get this crazy quirky bark. So this weirdly textured bark is very characteristic of this genus. They all pretty much have this. You don't see things that look like this on anything else. However, smaller members of the species do not have that yet, so you can't always use that. So if you don't have big bark, then you look at the leaves. So the leaves are alternately arranged. They are sort of obovate or even deltoid in that they're almost triangular shaped. They're widest at the very, very base of the leaf. They have this longer point here. They have fairly large serrations that go along the margins. And if you look at the veins, there are 3 main veins at the base of the leaf there. And so aren't too many trees like that. So that's one of the good ways to figure this one out. What else do we got? The leaf bases are also very frequently what we call oblique. Let me find a good one here. Here we go. They're oblique in that they are asymmetrical. So you can see one side's lower than the other. It's not always true, but it's usually true for most Celtis levigata leaves. So again, this is Celtis levigata, or the southern hackberry, in Canadensis, which is the hemp family. Slender twigs and petioles, 3-veined leaves, incredibly wonky bark when you get a big example. But in general, not too hard to ID if you can remember that combination of leaf traits. Our final plant for week 1 is pokeberry, or Phytolacca americana. It has its own family, the Phytolaceae. So this is an herb, but it's an unusually large herb. It can get even taller than this. It can be up to, I don't know, maybe 4 meters tall, maybe 5. It's quite a tall plant. But in the winter, it dies all the way back to the ground. So it manages to build this huge body in one growing season, which is pretty impressive. So you can tell it grows quickly. So this plant has very fleshy stems. They're almost succulent. So if you were to break it, it would have kind of a hollow core and then a lot of sort of succulence into it. The leaves are also fairly juicy feeling. Not quite succulent, but a little juicy. So it produces flowers in a raceme like this. This one has some that are still blooming towards the base where you can see them. And then once they're fertilized and they're ready to go, then they start developing berries. There aren't any mature berries on this individual, but the berries get a little bit bigger and they turn a bright dark purple that will very much stain your clothes if you get them on there. This plant, despite its delicious berries, should not be eaten. They're popular with birds, but they are toxic to mammals. So do not eat these delicious looking berries. You can use them to dye fabrics, but do not eat them. While the berries are definitely toxic to mammals, the leaves can be eaten. You just have to cook them. This is what they make poke salad out of, if you've ever had that in the mountains or have heard of it. You cook it kind of like spinach, and it tastes sort of like spinach, a little tangier. The leaves themselves are pretty nondescript. They have entire margins, they're alternate along the stem, and they're just sort of green. Stems are often this sort of purplish reddish color, but not always. What else do we got? That's about it for this guy. It's hard to mistake him for anything else because of that fleshy red stem, these long racemes of white flowers or berries, and these relatively large leaves for an herb. This is just a big, big herb. It's very common in weedy places. You'll see it on the sides of the road if it can get enough moisture. It can be kind of a garden pest because it grows very quickly. If you leave your garden alone for too long, you will suddenly have an 8-foot tall pokeberry in it. So Phytolacca americana, the pokeberry.